your government tightened up the gateway to emergency housing, and your officials warned at the time about the changes causing an increase in homelessness. Here's what they said, quote, making these changes ahead of significant increases to the supply of affordable housing and more preventative wraparound supports does create a risk of increased levels of rough sleeping, people living in cars and overcrowding. You pushed ahead with those changes anyway. Has changing the emergency housing policy increased homelessness?
I don't believe so. I think it has made the system clearer for everybody to understand. There will always be a need for emergency housing. I want to make that really clear. And for people who need emergency housing, it will always be there.
So you don't believe so? Based on what?
Based on what I see and hear around the place.
And give us some see and hear, that's just anecdotal.
That's like, I can remember a comedian once telling a joke about how society was struggling, and he was like, yeah, apparently the research says that everyone's getting poorer. Yeah, I've never been more rich. So it's basically that level of, what I'm seeing and hearing. No, like all the guys around me in that oval table on the 9th floor, they're all doing well. Their portfolios are looking fine.
Based on what I see and hear around the place.
But give us some data. See and hear, that's just anecdotal. Give us some data.
The register was 25,000 when we came in. It's now 20,000.
I understand the register's gone down. I understand the emergency housing's gone down. What about homeless numbers? Those changes came into effect at the end of August, right? So between September and January, Auckland Council's community impact team recorded a 53% increase in the number of people living in cars, parks or the streets. In the 12 months at the end of last year, Wellington data showed rough sleeper numbers increased by...
So this would be Jack pointing to data. Like, even if it's contestable, he's pointing to something. When the Bush, the guy who is making decisions and who is a representative for the government there, will and has pointed to nothing. The journalist, he's pointing to some data.
Streets. In the 12 months at the end of last year, Wellington data showed rough sleeper numbers increased by a third. Do you accept that your changes could have contributed to higher numbers of homeless people?
No, because I think when people are in those situations, they should talk to MSD and there will be housing support available for them. We spend...
He's saying no because there's an answer that hasn't worked yet. No, because they can be not homeless if they choose to be.
They should talk to MSD and there will be housing support available for them. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars every month on housing support, or tens of millions of dollars every month on hundreds of millions of dollars per year on housing support. There is social housing available. There's emergency. There's transitional housing.
We appreciate that these measures are. So no one's disputing that you've completely torn out all of the social supports that might be available. However, the changes that you introduced, it's pretty clear, have made the gateway to emergency housing much more complicated. So the State of the Nation report from the Salvation Army said that introducing reduction targets and tightening the criteria, the gateway to emergency housing, is likely, quote, a key contributor to the rising street homelessness.
Well, that's their view. We've also made
their view. It's the Auckland Council view. It's the Wellington measure as well.
We've also made it easier to get out. There are now hundreds, thousands of children who were living in emergency housing motels who are now living in warm, dry homes as a result of the changes made by the government.
So this is the critical point.
Children.
So emergency housing before you came in was costing New Zealand more than $300 million a year.
Correct.
Vastly expensive.
$1 million a day.
Yeah. So Tama Pōtaka, your associate minister, says that 80% of those moving out of emergency housing were going to better, more permanent solutions, which is great. But it still leaves 20%, right?
Yes.
And so if the policy settings that you have introduced put 80% of people from emergency housing into better options, but leave 20% of people on the streets, is it worth it?
Well, it's a great question, because what he's basically asking is that payoff okay with you guys? Is it okay to help the 80% to screw over the bottom 20% even more? It's a really interesting question. It's actually an interesting debate as well. You know, do you help 80% and fuck the 20%, or would that still be seen as a failure? Different political parties would see that differently.
But leave 20% of people on the streets, is it worth it?
Well, I don't think it's correct to say that those 20% are on the streets.
Except that you can't point to any data that actually suggests they aren't. And I can give you numbers from Auckland Council, from Wellington, concerns from the Salvation Army, which suggest the number of people sleeping on the streets.
We don't have trackers on everyone. We're not running a police state.
Well, Auckland Council...
Don't tell Winston Peters that. His supporters think these trackers on everybody. You know, just be aware. Just be aware.
We're not doing that yet.
We're not doing it yet. Good point.
I mean, Auckland Council's community impact team go and get this data all the time. Before you were in government, they got this data. And between September and January of this year, 227 more people were recorded as sleeping on the streets. There's data. You can't give me any.
there's that data, and then there's the
and then there's what people are telling you. I mean, this is the thing, right? And maybe it's a payoff that's worth making, especially given the expense, $300 million a year, emergency housing.
We'll just say this: we've missed you, Jack. Welcome back.
It's a payoff that's worth making, especially given the expense, $300 million a year. Emergency housing, a lot of people have said, was a terrible policy. You've described it as one of the biggest policy failures in New Zealand history. The question is, if the cost of getting all of those people out of emergency housing and into better options is that some fall through the cracks and end up on the streets, is it worth it?
There is always support available for people who are sleeping on the streets, who are sleeping rough, who are sleeping in cars. The government will always provide support for those people. MSD do that each and every day.